In an age when 100 warlords carved up the land into 100 kingdoms, one man rose faster than any other, Lord Kyan Ryo, a minor noble who armed his soldiers with the new thunder rifles and made every rival tremble at the sound of gunfire. Word of Kyan's rise reached every corner of the land within a few short seasons, and ambitious lords everywhere began quietly copying his methods, arming peasant conscripts with rifles instead of training samurai for a lifetime with the sword. The rifles Kyan imported were crude and slow to reload, but against samurai who had trained a lifetime with swords and bows, a peasant conscript with 3 weeks of practice could now bring down the finest warrior in the land. Kuroda's late father had once been among the most respected lords in the province, known for fair taxes and open granaries during famine years, a reputation Kyan erased completely within a single generation of conquest. Kyan had not been born to power. He clawed his way up from a minor household by being among the first lords brave enough to trust foreign thunder rifles over the sword, and within 8 years he had installed a puppet ruler of his own choosing. Among the lords he crushed was Kuroda Mason, stripped of his lands and his name in a single afternoon of humiliating defeat, left with nothing but a burning hatred that would consume the rest of his life. Kuroda spent his exile learning every detail of Kyan's routines, his travel routes, and his weaknesses, filling scroll after scroll with notes that would one day guide the hand of whichever assassin he finally chose to trust. Renjiro's reputation had been earned in a single legendary contest years earlier, where he split a hanging melon in half from over 200 paces while every other marksman in the province missed entirely. Kuroda had once ruled these same lands his family had held for 6 generations, until a single afternoon of gunfire ended it all. He buried his father and 2 brothers before the sun set that day, and swore their deaths would not go unanswered. For 3 long years, Kuroda searched every province for a man skilled enough to end Lord Kyan's life, until he finally found Renjiro, a masterless ronin whose aim with a matchlock rifle was said to be unmatched in the entire land. Standing over the wounded warlord for one brief, fatal instant before soldiers closed in, Renjiro realized with cold certainty that his one true chance had already come and gone, and it would not return again. Kuroda lived out the rest of his days under a false name in a distant province, farming quietly and never once speaking of the family and the vengeance he had ultimately been forced to leave unfinished. The last confirmed sighting of the wolf was nearly a full year later, far to the north near another trapper's territory, though those trappers too eventually vanished from the region without any clear explanation left behind. Renjiro accepted the mission without hesitation. Killing Lord Kyan with the very weapon that had made him feared would be, he thought, a fittingly poetic end for the warlord's reign. Renjiro had once served a noble house himself, until his own lord was crushed in Kyan's endless campaigns, leaving him a ronin with nothing left to lose and a reputation for hitting targets other marksmen wouldn't even attempt. Renjiro tracked Kyan's movements for months, finally learning that the warlord's army would soon be forced through a narrow mountain pass, the perfect place for a single, well-placed shot to end everything. The chase for Renjiro lasted the better part of a year, with Kyan's men burning 3 separate villages suspected of hiding him, turning much of the countryside against the warlord even as they searched for his would-be killer. At dawn, Lord Kyan's column entered the pass exactly as predicted, the warlord riding confidently at its head, utterly unaware of the rifle already trained on his chest from the ridge above. A village elder who secretly despised Kyan's endless taxes offered Renjiro shelter and food in exchange for nothing but silence, one of many quiet acts of defiance the warlord's spies could never quite stamp out. Ingrid had grown up in this same taiga and knew its old stories better than her husband did, tales passed down for generations about wild things that remembered debts far longer than any human ever could. Ingrid eventually remarried in the settlement years later, though she never once let her own children hunt young animals of any kind, telling them only that some debts in the wild were simply not worth risking. As the punishment stretched into its second day, travelers on the road began quietly refusing to pick up the saw at all, some even leaving small offerings of food and water just out of sight of the watching guards. Renjiro fired. The shot went wide, grazing only air. He grabbed his second rifle and fired again, This one struck Kyan's armor and knocked him from his horse, but the warlord rose almost immediately, barely scratched. Axel told himself repeatedly that a wolf's memory could not possibly stretch beyond a single season, a comforting lie he kept repeating to himself even as the nightly circling around his cabin grew steadily bolder. Furious and only lightly wounded, Kyan ordered his men to burn every village that might be sheltering his attacker, and swore a private oath that the gunman would face a punishment history itself would never forget. Their small cabin sat nearly a full day's walk from the nearest trading post, close enough to the wild taiga that wolves, bears, and lynx were simply a fact of daily life Axel had lived with since childhood. It took nearly a year, but Kyan's men finally found Renjiro hiding in a remote mountain temple, dragging him out in chains to face the warlord he had failed to kill. Kuroda, learning of Renjiro's capture, fled deep into the mountains himself, changing his name and vowing from hiding that even Kyan's cruelty would not be the end of the story between their two families. The trading post agent barely glanced twice at the small wolf pelts, paying Axel just enough for a sack of grain and a little salted meat, nowhere near enough to explain what the decision would end up costing him. Kyan devised a punishment meant to last as long and painfully as possible. Renjiro was buried in the earth up to his neck beside the main road, a dull bamboo saw placed beside him, and a sign inviting every passerby to take a single cut. Word of the punishment spread through every province, and for years afterward, no rival dared move against Lord Kyan again, though those closest to him whispered that the warlord's victory had cost him something he could never quite get back. Vane's most trusted enforcers were once ordinary farmers and tradesmen who had genuinely believed in his early promises of equality, only to find themselves years later enforcing the very same cruelties they had once marched against. Kyan ruled for another 20 years, expanding his territory until his name was known in every corner of the land, yet visitors to his court always noted a warlord who slept lightly, and never once sat with his back to an open door. On the third night, the noises stopped entirely, and an unnatural silence settled over the cabin that somehow felt far more unsettling than any of the chaos that had come before it. Long after Alaric's own death, his descendants would still point to the day Vane's body was dragged through the capital as the moment the old wars finally, truly ended, even if the manner of that ending never sat entirely comfortably with anyone who witnessed it. Deep in the frozen wilderness of the northern taiga, a trapper named Axel Voss had gone 3 days without a single catch, his family's cabin running dangerously low on food as another brutal winter closed in. On the 4th morning, Axel's dogs found a fresh wolf den half buried beneath a fallen tree, and inside it, 3 sleeping wolf pups, alone while their mother hunted somewhere in the distance. Alaric's own mother, who had died quietly in exile years before his return, never lived to see her son crowned, a private grief he carried silently beneath every public celebration that followed his homecoming. Ingrid took the children and fled to her sister's home in the nearest settlement the very next morning, leaving Axel alone at the cabin against her every protest, convinced he still had time to make things right on his own. Axel's wife Ingrid had begged him not to go out again so soon, watching their 2 young children grow thinner each week as the family's dried stores dwindled toward nothing before the deepest part of winter even arrived. In the weeks following the coronation, Alaric quietly restored his father's old policy of open granaries during hard winters, a small unannounced act that did more to earn the kingdom's trust than any feast or speech ever could. Desperate and out of options, Axel made a choice he would spend the rest of his life regretting. He took the pups for pelts to trade at the trading post, telling himself survival left him no other way. Alaric had been raised expecting to inherit a peaceful, prosperous kingdom, and the sudden collapse of everything he knew left him wandering foreign courts for years, dependent on the charity of relatives who slowly grew tired of hosting an exiled prince. That night, back at his cabin, Axel heard something enormous circling in the darkness outside, knocking over supply crates, snapping at the wooden walls, refusing to leave no matter how loudly the dogs barked. What Axel never realized was that the mother wolf had been circling wide around his own trapline for days, growing bolder each night as her hunger for her missing pups outweighed her fear of the humans she usually avoided. Axel fled at first light to a neighboring trapper's cabin miles away, breathless and shaking, begging for help against something in the woods he swore was hunting him specifically and no one else. Ingrid begged Axel to simply give back whatever he had taken, certain that whatever was circling their home each night would leave them alone the moment it got back what it wanted most. Under Vane's rule, taxes tripled within 2 years, festivals and public gatherings were banned outright as frivolous distractions, and entire towns that resisted his new laws found their markets forcibly shut down without warning. His neighbor refused to believe an animal could hold such a grudge and sent him on his way. Alone again, Axel had no choice but to return to his own cabin as the sun began sinking behind the pines. When he arrived, his storage shed had been torn completely open and the pelts were gone. Standing at the tree lean, half hidden in shadow, was a massive gray wolf, watching him without moving an inch. Alaric's coronation feast lasted 3 full days, with musicians and dancers filling the halls his father had once ruled from, the first true celebration the exhausted kingdom had allowed itself in nearly a decade. But it was already too late. The pelts had long since been sold at the trading post 2 days' walk away, and there was nothing left in Axel's hands to give back to the creature waiting for him in the dark. Axel raised his rifle with shaking hands, but before he could fire, the wolf vanished silently back into the trees, leaving him alone in the growing dark with a fear that would never fully leave him again. Historians in later generations would debate endlessly whether Alaric's final act of vengeance against a dead man diminished his legacy or simply proved he was, in the end, still painfully human like everyone who came before him. A search party found Axel's cabin abandoned 2 weeks later, the door left wide open and his rifle still leaning untouched against the wall. Axel himself was never seen in that territory again. When the search party finally found the abandoned cabin, they also found something stranger still, 3 small wolf pelts, the very ones Axel had taken, laid carefully back at the edge of the tree lean as if someone, or something, had returned them. To this day, trappers in that region still leave young animals of any kind well alone, telling newcomers the old story of a debt the wilderness itself never forgets to collect. Prince Alaric was 21 years old when his father's kingdom collapsed, forced to flee into exile as a puritanical general named Marcus Vane seized total control of the throne in the name of the common people. The civil war that toppled Alaric's father began years earlier, when the old king tried to arrest his loudest critics inside the royal council chamber itself, an act that shattered whatever fragile peace still held the fractured kingdom together. For 9 long years, Alaric lived as a penniless exile abroad, watching from afar as General Vane ruled his father's kingdom with an iron fist, crushing every voice that dared oppose him. General Vane, once a simple landowner with no military training at all, proved a ruthlessly effective commander once war broke out, driven by an unshakable belief that he alone was chosen to correct the kingdom's every wrong. General Vane's rule grew increasingly harsh with each passing year, and when he died peacefully in his own bed, it seemed as though he had escaped justice completely, taking his crimes quietly to the grave. Once in power, Vane's rule grew steadily crueler. He silenced an entire council of reformers who dared question his authority, and dissolved parliament altogether the moment it stood in his way. Within a year of Vane's death, his own son proved too gentle a ruler to hold the fractured kingdom together, and the exhausted nation finally invited Prince Alaric home to reclaim his father's throne. Alaric returned to a kingdom erupting in celebration, church bells ringing across every town as crowds lined the roads just to catch a glimpse of their long-awaited king riding home at last. Alaric's advisors were deeply divided over the pardon. Some argued that mercy for Vane's followers would finally heal the broken kingdom, while others quietly warned that forgiveness offered too freely could look a great deal like weakness to their enemies. Crowned king at last, Alaric proved a genuinely beloved ruler, and in a gracious gesture, he pardoned nearly everyone who had once served under General Vane's rule, with one singular exception he could never quite let go of. On the anniversary of his father's downfall, King Alaric ordered General Vane's body exhumed from its resting place and dragged through the capital in chains, a symbolic reckoning for a man who had died before ever facing one. Even among the common people gathered to watch, opinions split sharply down old wartime lines. Those who had suffered directly under Vane's rule cheered loudly, while others who remembered his early promises of fairness stood in uneasy silence. The public spectacle drew crowds from every corner of the kingdom, some cheering the overdue justice, others quietly uneasy watching a king spend his energy settling scores with a man who could no longer answer for himself. In the years that followed, King Alaric was remembered as a fair and beloved ruler who rebuilt his shattered kingdom, though court historians always noted, quietly in their private journals, that even a king's justice could look uncomfortably close to vengeance. 3 very different stories. 3 very different deaths. But in each one, the same bitter truth remained: revenge may settle a score, but it rarely, if ever, settles the soul that carried it out.